There is a question hanging over this tournament that nobody at FIFA wants to answer directly. Not about the football, not about the bracket or the favorites, or which group looks like a meat grinder, or which underdog has the legs to make a real run. A different kind of question, a more uncomfortable one. Can every team that actually qualified get here? Because 5 nations heading into this World Cup are carrying a weight that has nothing to do with tactical preparation, squad depth, or the pressure of expectation. They are carrying genuine, unresolved uncertainty about whether their players, their officials, and their supporters can navigate the specific challenges that this particular tournament, staged across 3 countries in a climate of extraordinary complexity, has placed directly in front of them. That is not a small thing. That is a story about the soul of the sport, about what it actually means to say that football unites the world, when the world cannot always find its way to the football. So today, we are going through 5 nations whose situations heading into this World Cup raise questions that deserve serious and honest examination. Not hysteria, not exaggeration, but the kind of clear-eyed look at what is actually happening that fans who have followed this sport for decades deserve to receive. Let us start with the most acute situation, the one that has generated more genuine uncertainty than anything else in the entire build-up to this tournament. Iran qualified for the 2026 World Cup. They trained, they prepared. Their players, who had absolutely nothing to do with the decisions of governments and who simply wanted to compete in the sport they have devoted their lives to, went through the same 4-year journey that every other qualified nation went through. And in the days immediately before the tournament begins, those players were still waiting for their visas to enter the United States. Still waiting. With the opening match imminent, with their group stage games scheduled in Los Angeles and Seattle, and with the documentation required to enter the host country of their own tournament still sitting unresolved. It took until June 5th for the U.S. to finally grant visas to the players themselves, just 10 days before Iran's opening match. 10 days. For a team that qualified months ago. But visas for the players turned out to be only part of the story. Several members of Iran's support staff, including Mehdi Taj, the head of the Iranian Football Federation, were denied entry altogether. 15 administrative and management officials had their visa applications rejected. Iran's ambassador to Mexico told the squad directly that, under the conditions attached to their visas, the players are required to enter and exit United States territory on the same day as each match. Enter in the morning. Leave the same day. No exceptions. FIFA took a specific step in response to all of this. They permitted the Iranian national team to move their base camp from the United States to Mexico. Originally, Iran had planned to train in Tucson, Arizona. Instead, the squad relocated to Tijuana, just across the border from San Diego. The players would cross into the U.S. to play their scheduled matches, but they would prepare, recover, and live in Mexico, rather than on American soil. Think about what that arrangement actually reveals. A team that qualified for a tournament, unable to base themselves in the primary host country of that tournament, using a neighboring nation as a staging ground from which to cross a border just to play their games. An arrangement with no precedent in World Cup history. An arrangement that required FIFA to navigate a situation their pre-tournament planning clearly had not fully prepared for. The players themselves have spoken with a dignity and a composure that deserves real acknowledgement. They are footballers. They want to play. The geopolitical circumstances surrounding their nation are not of their making and not within their control. An Iranian official described the visa denials as, quote, political interference in sport in its worst form. Whether you agree with that characterization or not, the situation itself is undeniable. No World Cup team has ever faced this particular set of obstacles in quite this way. And the fact that it happened at a tournament built on the language of inclusion and welcome makes the contrast even harder to look away from. Iran's situation is the sharpest edge of a broader access problem that affects multiple nations heading into 2026. But it is far from the only one. The African nations that qualified for this tournament are carrying a specific frustration that built throughout the entire preparation period and was never adequately resolved. The United States introduced a visa bond requirement, a financial deposit of up to $15,000, that applied to fans from 5 African countries: Algeria, Cape Verde, Ivory Coast, Senegal, and Tunisia. $15,000. In the context of the economies of those nations, that sum does not represent a hurdle. It represents an effective ban on ordinary supporters attending matches involving their own national teams. Most fans from those countries do not have $15,000 sitting in a bank account. They can lock up as a deposit with the American government just to buy a plane ticket to a soccer match. The requirement was eventually waived, but only in mid-May, weeks before the tournament was due to begin, after months during which fans from those countries had been trying to plan around an obstacle that made attending virtually impossible. The damage done by months of uncertainty is not undone by a late waiver. Flights had not been booked. Hotel rooms had not been reserved. The window for affordable, realistic planning had long since closed. The fans who might have traveled, who wanted to travel, who had qualified teams to cheer for, were left unable to do what football supporters at every previous World Cup had always been able to do: follow their team. This is not an abstract injustice. This is a grandmother in Dakar who cannot watch her country play in a World Cup, a group of friends in Cameroon who followed every single qualifying match and cannot get to the tournament their team actually qualified for. Real people, real supporters, real football. And a bureaucratic barrier that stood between them and the game they love for months longer than it ever should have. The waiver came, but the timing tells you something important about how the needs of African supporters were weighted in the planning of this tournament. The third nation whose situation raises serious questions is one that might surprise you, because unlike Iran and unlike the African nations navigating visa barriers, this country's concerns are domestic, internal, and in some ways more difficult to resolve, because they originate within one of the tournament's own host nations, Mexico. Mexico is co-hosting this World Cup. They are staging 13 matches, including games in Mexico City and Guadalajara. The Azteca, newly renamed but historically unchanged in its significance, is hosting the opening match. Mexico's contribution to this tournament in terms of football culture, passion, and atmosphere is irreplaceable and genuine. This is a country that lives and breathes this sport. The atmosphere at a Mexican World Cup venue is something genuinely special, and the Azteca on opening night will be exactly that. And yet, in the weeks before the tournament began, a serious security incident occurred at one of Mexico's most visited tourist sites. A lone attacker opened fire at the top of the Teotihuacan pyramids, a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most visited attractions in the entire country. One Canadian tourist was killed, 13 others were injured. The Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, admitted publicly that the site lacked adequate security measures to prevent the attack. The government's own security secretary described it as, quote, an isolated incident, and announced immediate steps to increase the presence of the National Guard, intensify security checks, and expand surveillance systems at archaeological sites and major tourist locations across the country. The incident raised immediate and serious questions about security protocols in the run-up to a tournament that will bring hundreds of thousands of international visitors to Mexican cities. The government has committed to deploying 100,000 security personnel across the country, with a specific focus on the 3 host cities, Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey. More than 2,000 military vehicles, along with aircraft and drones, will be utilized, with security perimeters established around stadiums and airports in key locations. But those questions sit alongside a broader security conversation that has been running throughout Mexico's entire preparation period. The state of Jalisco, where Guadalajara is located and where 4 Mexico World Cup matches are scheduled, has been at the center of security concerns, connected to cartel activity following a significant law enforcement operation earlier this year. Mexico has hosted 2 World Cups before. The country understands what tournament football requires. The organizational competence is there. The passion is genuine and deep. FIFA President Gianni Infantino has expressed full confidence in Mexico as a host nation. The realistic expectation is that the matches in Mexican cities will be staged safely and that the atmosphere, particularly at the Azteca, will be everything a World Cup opening should be. But the questions are real, and the fans traveling to Mexican host cities deserve to know that those questions are being taken seriously rather than dismissed with reassurance. The 4th nation on this list illustrates something important about the access problem from a completely different angle, a different kind of concern, not about visas, not about security, about choice. The Netherlands. The Dutch qualified for this tournament with a squad of genuine quality. Their supporters, among the most committed and most visually spectacular traveling fans in world football, had every expectation of making the journey to North America in significant numbers. These are people who travel to World Cups in orange waves, who fill entire sections of stadiums with noise and color, who have made Dutch supporter culture one of the most recognizable things in international football. And then, 170,000 Dutch citizens signed a petition asking the national team not to go. 170,000 people. Not a fringe movement, not a small group of activists with a particular agenda. A genuine mass expression of concern, serious enough to reach the Dutch cabinet, which ultimately rejected the boycott position. The team will play. The players want that shot. Nobody is going to stop a qualified squad from a World Cup when the players themselves want to be there. But the scale of that petition, and the fact that it emerged from one of Europe's most football-passionate nations, one with a deep and genuine connection to the game, tells you something real about the climate in which this tournament is being staged. Dutch supporters who, under normal circumstances, would be booking flights and painting themselves orange months in advance, are instead having a national conversation about whether attending is the right thing to do. That is new. That is different from anything we have seen at a major tournament in recent memory. And the Netherlands is not alone. The heads of 20 European football federations were involved in boycott discussions in the build-up to this tournament. 20. Not 20 fringe voices. 20 leaders of established national football organizations, representing countries whose supporters have shaped World Cup atmospheres for generations. The boycott did not materialize at the national team level, but the individual boycott, the fan who decided not to travel, the supporter who sold their ticket, the person who will watch from home rather than make the journey, that boycott is happening. It is visible in hotel booking data. It is visible in the empty seat projections that analysts have been publishing for certain group stage matches. It is the accumulated consequence of months of pricing concerns, access barriers, and broader uncertainties that were never fully resolved. For the Netherlands specifically, and for the European football supporter base more broadly, this tournament represents something they did not anticipate when it was awarded. A World Cup that requires a calculation they have genuinely never had to make before. Is it safe to go? Can we get visas? Can we afford the tickets? Will we be welcome? Those questions should not exist at a World Cup. They should not exist. And the fact that they do, for Dutch supporters, for fans across Europe, for supporters from nations on every continent, is the clearest measure of how far the preparation for this tournament has fallen short of what the game deserved. The fifth nation sits in a different category from the others, because their concerns are not about access or security or visa barriers or a political statement. Their concerns are about something more fundamental to the tournament experience itself, about the sheer practical reality of what it asks of ordinary fans. Australia qualified, their squad, built around a generation of players competing in European leagues, shaped by the momentum of their extraordinary Qatar 2022 campaign, where they reached the quarterfinals for the first time in their history, arrived at this tournament with genuine ambition and genuine quality. Graham Arnold's project produced something real in Qatar. The players who carried that torch into 2026 represent a generation of Australian football that deserves to be seen. But the traveling supporter base from Australia faces a journey that tests the limits of what ordinary football fans can reasonably be asked to do. Australia to North America, across the Pacific, across a time zone gap that makes scheduling an absolute constant challenge. Tickets that, at the prices FIFA has set for this tournament, represent a significant financial commitment on top of the already enormous cost of the journey itself. When you add up flights, accommodation, and match tickets, you are looking at tens of thousands of dollars per person for a complete group stage experience. That is not a casual commitment. That is a major life expenditure. Australian football supporters have long been among the most committed long-distance travelers in the game. The fans who went to Germany in 2006, the fans who made the journey to South Africa in 2010, the the fans who traveled to Brazil in 2014. Those people made sacrifices that reflected a genuine, deep love for the sport and their national team. They did it on tight budgets, with enormous planning, and with the kind of dedication that most supporter cultures in the world would recognize and respect. This tournament is asking them to make those same sacrifices against a backdrop of ticket prices that have increased dramatically from the previous edition, and access barriers that have made the planning process more complex than it has ever been. The result is a traveling Australian supporter contingent expected to be significantly smaller than what Qatar produced. Not because the passion has diminished, not because the love for the Socceroos has faded, but because the practical calculation has shifted in ways that exclude people who would otherwise be there. That is a loss. A quiet loss. The kind that does not generate headlines, but that changes the atmosphere inside a stadium in ways that are real and that matter. What ties all 5 of these nations together, Iran, the African nations, Mexico, the Netherlands, Australia, is that their situations are different in their specific nature, but connected by a single, common thread. The 2026 World Cup was the first tournament to have human rights criteria formally embedded in the bidding process. Every host city published a plan declaring the ways it would promote human rights and inclusion. The language of access and welcome was built into the very foundation of how this tournament was conceived and awarded. FIFA itself made those commitments publicly and explicitly. And the reality of what multiple nations are experiencing in the final days of preparation does not fully match that language. It does not match for Iran, whose players waited until 10 days before their first match to find out whether they could even enter the host country, and whose federation officials were denied entry entirely. It does not match for African fans who were subject to a $15,000 bond requirement for months, an obstacle that effectively priced entire supporter bases out of their own team's World Cup, and who only received relief late enough that the practical window for travel had already closed. It does not match for European supporters who are making calculations about safety and welcome that they have never had to make at any previous tournament in the history of the competition. This matters because of what a World Cup is supposed to be. Not a revenue exercise, not a commercial event that happens to involve football. The World Cup is the game's greatest expression of its own stated purpose, that football genuinely does unite the world, that it crosses borders and breaks down barriers and creates moments of shared humanity that nothing else in sport quite replicates. Those are not marketing words. Those are words that people who love this sport actually believe. That is why the tournament matters the way it does. That is why a grandmother in Dakar cares. That is why a group of friends in Sydney starts saving years in advance. That is why an Iranian player, who has nothing to do with the decisions of governments, spends 4 years working toward a moment on a football pitch. When nations cannot get their players settled before the tournament begins, when supporters cannot afford to follow their teams, when the question of whether it is safe to travel to a host city is genuinely being asked and genuinely being felt, the stated purpose of the tournament is in direct tension with the reality of staging it. FIFA has insisted throughout that everything is in hand, that the tournament will be delivered, that the football will speak for itself, and the football, once it begins, once the matches are played, once the extraordinary quality of 48 nations competing in 104 games generates the moments that this sport always generates at its highest level, will indeed speak. Nobody who loves this game doubts that. The football will be real, and it will be brilliant, and it will produce things that remind everyone exactly why this tournament exists. But the story of who got to hear it, of who was in the stadium and who was watching from a sofa because they could not get there, of which supporters made the journey and which were turned back by prices or paperwork or the specific complexities of a tournament staged in this particular moment, that story will also be told. It will be part of the legacy of 2026, for as long as people write about this tournament. Long after the winner lifts the trophy, the questions this build-up raised will remain part of the historical record. The 5 nations we covered today are not alone in their concerns. They represent a broader picture of access and inclusion that this World Cup has not fully resolved. But they are the sharpest illustrations of questions that go to the heart of what this tournament is, who it is actually for, and whether the promises made when it was awarded were ever truly meant to be kept. 5 days from now, the Azteca fills. The football begins. The players who have spent 4 years working toward this moment get their shot. And however complicated the path to that moment has been, the Iranian players who waited until the last possible moment to find out if they could even show up, the African supporters who were priced out by a bond requirement that should never have existed, the European fans making a calculation their parents never had to make at any previous edition of this tournament, the Australians calculating whether the journey is even financially possible. When that first ball is kicked in Mexico City, the game will be there, doing what the game has always done, transcending the circumstances around it, producing something that the people who love football recognize immediately, regardless of where they are watching from, whether from a seat at the Azteca or a couch on the other side of the world. That is the thing about this sport. It keeps showing up, even when the institutions around it do not.